Carried on the morning wind, the smell of wood smoke and coffee reached Grace Calloway before the town of Harlan's Creek even came into view. She sat straight-backed on the buckboard seat of the mail coach, her one good traveling bag wedged between her feet, and she told herself she was not afraid. She was a widow of 26 with $11 to her name and a letter of introduction from Reverend Potts of Abilene tucked inside her bodice, and she had made harder crossings than this. But Harlan's Creek, Idaho, in the autumn of 1889 was not Abilene, and the people waiting at the end of this rutted road were strangers, and she knew, the way a woman knows things she cannot quite explain, that what happened in the next hour would set the course of the next year, maybe longer. The driver called the team to a halt at the edge of a wide, hard-packed yard where a general store and a livery stable faced each other like old men who had stopped speaking years ago. Grace climbed down without waiting for help. That was the first thing the town of Harlan's Creek noticed about her. She did not wait. The second thing they noticed was that she walked straight toward the bench outside Calloway's Mercantile, no relation, and sat down next to a small girl who was sitting alone, with her chin tucked and her shoes pointed inward, and every other woman on that porch had left a careful, deliberate space between herself and that child. Before that autumn was finished, Grace would hear a man say the words she had given up expecting any man to say, and she would understand, when he said them, that the long road from Abilene had carried her exactly where she was meant to go. But first, there was the little girl. Her name, Grace would learn in the next few minutes, was Molly Cutter. She was 5 years old, and she was the reason everything that followed was possible. Molly had wide brown eyes and a braid that had come half undone, the ribbon at the end hanging by a single loop, and she was holding a cloth doll pressed flat against her chest, the way children hold things they are afraid might be taken. Grace sat down beside her without ceremony, without looking around to count the disapproving faces, and said, "That's a fine-looking doll. Does she have a name?" Molly looked up with the particular wariness of a child who has learned that adult attention usually precedes disappointment. "Clara," she said, barely above a whisper. "Clara is a good name," Grace said, and meant it, and that was the whole of the introduction. The boy who ran the livery, he was perhaps 14, came around the corner at a near trot and stopped when he saw Grace. "Ma'am, that's Levi Cutter's girl," he said, with the particular urgency of someone delivering a warning. Grace looked at him pleasantly. "I can see she's somebody's girl," she said. "She has good manners." The boy opened his mouth, closed it, and went back around the corner. The women on the porch did not speak to Grace directly, but she heard them behind her. Their voices dropped low in the way that is meant to be overheard. The words she caught were ranch hand and no mother, and trouble enough without outsiders involving themselves. She had heard that register of voice before, in Abilene, directed at herself. She knew what it cost a person to be talked about in that tone, and she knew what it cost a child more. She sat where she was. After a while, Molly leaned a small degree in Grace's direction, the way a cold creature will lean toward warmth without quite meaning to, and Grace pretended not to notice. A man appeared at the far end of the street. He was tall and lean, and walked with the careful economy of someone who had been on his feet since before light, which he had. He was carrying a feed sack over one shoulder and a child's coat over the other arm, and when he saw Molly on the bench, he stopped walking so abruptly that the sack swung forward, and he had to step to keep his balance. He looked at Molly. He looked at Grace. His face was weathered and hard-planed and gave nothing away. He said, "Molly, come here." It was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had learned to keep his words short because he had lost the luxury of wasting them. Molly slid off the bench, still holding Clara flat against her chest, and went to him. He crouched down and settled the coat around her shoulders in one practiced movement, and then he stood up and looked at Grace again. "She bother you?" Grace said. She was good company. He studied her the way men study a piece of ground they do not know the depth of. "You're the widow Potts wrote about," he said. It was not a question. "Grace Calloway," she said. "Levi Cutter," he said. He did not offer his hand. He said, "The offer stands if you still want it. Cook and keep house for the winter. The cabin has a back room. It's not much." Grace stood up and picked up her traveling bag. "I've lived in not much before," she said. "When do we start?" He looked at her for another moment. "Now," he said, and they started. The cabin was 4 miles out of Harlan's Creek, along a creek-bottom road that wound through stands of yellow cottonwood, their leaves coming down in slow, deliberate spirals like something being carefully let go. Levi drove and Molly sat between them on the buckboard seat, which Levi had clearly not anticipated, because he shifted once to give the child more room, and then spent the better part of a mile with his elbow pressed awkwardly against his own ribs to avoid crowding Grace. Molly fell asleep before they reached the property line, her head tipping inevitably against Grace's arm. Levi noticed and said nothing. The cabin itself was honest, in the way that things built by one pair of hands tend to be, solid, plain, and marked everywhere by the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped expecting company. There was one chair at the table. There were 2 hooks by the door, one of which held a child's bonnet so small it made Grace's chest tighten. The stove was good, which was what mattered most in a place that would see serious cold by November. And the back room had a cot and a window that faced east, which meant light in the mornings, which meant Grace would be able to endure a great deal else. Levi set her bag inside the door and said, "I'll be in the barn," and was gone before she could ask where anything was kept. She found the flour by looking. She found the salt and the lard and a quarter side of bacon hanging in the lean-to, and she found, on a high shelf she had to stand on a crate to reach, a tin of dried apples that had been there long enough to look like someone had put them there and then forgotten they were capable of hope. She made biscuits and fried bacon and stewed the apples down with a little sugar and set the table for 3. Then she stood back and looked at the table and understood that the second and third plates were a statement of some kind, and that the man who came in from the barn and stood in the doorway looking at them would understand it the same way. He did. He looked at the plates and at Grace and then at Molly, who had arranged Clara in a 4th position at the table's corner, and was explaining to her in a low, serious voice what each dish was. He sat down. He said grace, briefly, the way a man says grace who still believes but has gotten out of the habit of feeling like God is listening closely, and they ate. Molly talked about the doll. Grace answered her questions about Abilene. Levi ate without speaking, which might have felt like refusal but did not, because he was paying the kind of attention to the conversation that is harder to maintain than speech. When supper was done and Molly was asleep on her cot with Clara beside her and the lamp turned down, Levi sat at the table with his coffee and Grace sat across from him with hers, and they talked about what the arrangement actually meant in practical terms, because that was the kind of people they both were. He said he could pay her $4 a month and keep, which was less than she might have hoped and more than she had. She said that was acceptable. He said he rode out most days by 5:30 and came in by dark. She said she would have breakfast waiting. He said Molly sometimes woke in the night calling for her mother, and that Grace should not be alarmed, he would see to it. Grace looked at her coffee cup. "How long has it been?" she said. 2 years come March, he said. He did not say the woman's name, and Grace did not ask it. She understood that there are griefs a person keeps in their own room, the way she kept hers, behind a door that stays shut not out of secrecy, but out of the plain necessity of continuing to function. She said, "She seems like a happy child." He said, "She is, mostly." The word mostly carried a weight he did not explain and did not need to. Grace knew what mostly meant in a sentence like that. She had been someone's mostly for a year after Thomas died, showing up to the table and the chores and the hours of the day, while some part of her remained behind, waiting for something she could not name. "I'll do right by her," Grace said. It was the plainest and most serious thing she had said all day. Levi looked up from his cup. He looked at her with that same measuring quality. Only this time, she felt that he was not measuring distance, but something else. "I know," he said. And he said it with a certainty that surprised her, because they had known each other less than one day. October passed, and then November arrived with cold on its heels, sharp and absolute, and the world outside the cabin windows turned the color of iron. Levi came in each evening stamped with cold, and Grace had stew or beans or biscuits waiting. And Molly dragged her stool close to the stove and told Clara everything that had happened that day, which was mostly Grace teaching her to roll out dough or identify the letters in her name. The women in Harlan's Creek had not warmed to Grace. Mrs. Aldridge at the general store spoke to her with a politeness so precisely calibrated it was barely distinguishable from rudeness, and the women at the Sunday service greeted her with the kind of careful distance that tells a person exactly where the line is drawn. Grace was not a fool. She understood that a widow who kept house for a widower was a particular kind of scandal in a small town, and that the fact of Levi being a ranch hand rather than a property owner gave the gossip an added edge, the suggestion that they were both a little outside the safe boundaries of Harlan's Creek society. What she had not expected was the visit from Gerald Marsh. Marsh ran the Consolidated Grazing Company's interests in the valley, and he arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November with 2 men behind him and a manner that assumed his arrival was welcome. He said he had a proposition for Levi regarding the lease on the creek bottom acres, and when Grace said Levi was out on the range and would not be back until evening, Marsh looked her over in a way that made the back of her neck go tight. He said it was too bad she was spending her winter in such poor accommodations. He said the Consolidated had a position for a woman of competence, managing the company boarding house, and that it came with considerably better wages. He said it in front of Molly, who was sitting on the floor with her doll, and he said it in a tone that made it clear the offer was also a comment on the life Grace was currently living. Grace dried her hands on her apron and looked at him and said, "I'll tell Mr. Cutter you came." Marsh smiled with his teeth and said, "You do that." After they left, Molly looked up from the floor and said, "I don't like that man." Grace said, "Then we agree," and went back to her bread. Levi came in that evening and Grace told him about Marsh and the morning visit, plain and without embellishment, the way she told him most things. He stood very still while she talked. He had a quality of stillness, when something mattered to him, that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the stillness of a man controlling something that would otherwise move. He said he come inside, she said. He stood in the doorway. He said, "He say anything to Molly?" She said, "Not directly." Levi nodded once. He went to the stove and poured his coffee and stood looking at the wall behind it for a moment. Then he said, "Marsh has been pushing on the creek bottom lease for 6 months. He wants the water rights and he doesn't much care how he gets them. My arrangement with old Henson is verbal, which Marsh knows." Grace sat down at the table. She thought about the tin of dried apples on the high shelf, put there by someone who had once had plans that included having apples to use. She thought about the second chair Levi had brought in from the barn in the second week of October, without explanation, setting it at the table as if it had always been there, as if he had simply forgotten to include it in the original count. She said, "Can Henson put it in writing?" He said, "Henson is 73, and his eyesight is going, and his son in Boise controls his affairs." He said it without self-pity. He was a man who described the facts of his situation, the way you'd describe weather. This is what is coming. Now let's figure out what to do about it. Then we need to talk to Reverend Aldrich before Marsh gets there first, Grace said. He looked at her. "Why Aldrich?" she said. "Because Aldrich performed Henson's first marriage and baptized his children, and Henson trusts him, and a minister can witness a document Even when a lawyer won't ride this far in November." Levi was quiet for a long moment. "You figured that out just now?" she said. "I've been thinking about it since this morning." He looked at her across the table with an expression she could not entirely read, but it contained something that might, in a year with better luck, have been called admiration. He said, "All right," and that was how they started to fight back. Reverend Aldrich came out on a Thursday, his old gray mare picking her way carefully down the frozen road, and sat at Levi's table and drank Grace's coffee and listened to the situation with the attention of a man who has learned that the slowest way to understand something is to talk while the other person is trying to explain it. When Levi had finished, Aldrich said, "Henson won't put his name to paper without his son's agreement." Levi said, "I know." Aldrich stirred his coffee, but his son might agree to something he didn't think of as a lease at all. He looked at Grace when he said it, and Grace understood what he was suggesting before Levi did. She looked at her hands. She looked at Molly, who was in the corner with Clara, and a small pile of wooden blocks she had arranged into what she called a house. She said, "You mean a different kind of legal standing?" Aldrich said, "A wife has standing in a property matter that a housekeeper does not. That is simply the law as it stands." The room was quiet except for the stove and the sound of Molly explaining to Clara which block was the door. Grace looked at Levi. He was looking at the table. He said, without looking up, "I'm not asking you to do that." She said, "I know you're not." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She thought about the road from Abilene and $11 and Reverend Potts's letter and sitting down next to Molly on that bench, and she thought about the ribbon on Molly's braid that Levi retied every morning, with a patience that broke her heart a little each time she witnessed it. She said, "Molly." Molly looked up. Grace said, "Would it be all right with you if I stayed?" Molly looked at her with those wide brown eyes. She said, "Are you going to stay always?" Grace said, "That would be the idea." Molly considered this with the gravity of a person for whom always was not a small word. She said, "Clara says yes." Levi looked up then. He looked at Grace, and his face was not hard-planed anymore. It was something else. He said, "This isn't the way I would have asked." Grace said, "I know." He said, "But I would have asked." He said it quietly, the way a person says the most important thing they've said all year. Grace felt something inside her chest that had been keeping very still for 2 years shift forward slightly, the way a door moves when someone on the other side turns the latch. "Then let's do it right," she said. Reverend Aldrich smiled into his coffee cup. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun, falling slow and deliberate through the last of the afternoon light, covering the frozen ground in something clean. They married on a Saturday in December in Reverend Aldrich's front room, which smelled of pine resin and old hymn books, with Molly standing between them holding Clara and wearing the ribbon Grace had sewn onto a new braid that morning, blue calico to match her eyes. Aldrich spoke the words plainly, and they answered them plainly. And when it was done, Levi took Grace's hand and held it a moment longer than the ceremony required, and she let him, and it was the first time she had felt a man's hand around hers since Thomas. And it was different from Thomas, but it was not lesser. It was its own thing, new and careful and honest. The document Aldrich had drawn up went to Henson's son by courier the following Monday, and the son, faced with a married couple's claim rather than a laboring man's verbal arrangement, found the path of least resistance and signed. Marsh rode out one afternoon in January and looked at the paper Levi showed him from the cabin doorway and turned his horse without a word. That was the end of that. January was cold and February was colder, and they lived inside the cold together, which is one of the oldest ways of coming to know a person. Grace learned that Levi woke before the dawn because he could not help it, and Levi learned that Grace sang quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening, old hymns mostly, the kind that do not require an audience. Molly's nighttime crying grew less frequent and then stopped altogether. replaced by a habit of appearing in the doorway of whatever room held the most warmth, which was generally wherever Grace happened to be. One evening in late February, Levi sat down at the table after supper and said, without preamble, "I want to thank you." Grace looked up. He said, for sitting down next to her, that first day. He said it the way he said the things that cost him something. "They told me not to," Grace said. He said, "I know." She said, she looked like she needed someone to sit with her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So did I." And that was the thing she had given up expecting a man to say. She had expected a great many things: difficulty, loneliness, the particular cold that lives in a house where grief has not yet finished its work, and she had received some of each. But she had not expected to be seen clearly by a man who had been keeping his own counsel for 2 hard years, and to feel, in being seen, that the road from Abilene had been not a loss but a leading. By the time the first green came back to the creek bottom, there were 2 chairs at the table and a shelf on the east wall that Levi had built on a Sunday in March, sanding the wood smooth without being asked, hanging it at a height suited to Grace's reach. She put the tin of dried apples on it because it had been waiting long enough, and next to it, the small blue ribbon Molly had worn at the wedding, pressed flat and saved, because some things deserve to be kept. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to bud, pale and hesitant as all new things are, and Molly stood on the porch and reported each development to Clara with great seriousness. Levi stood behind Grace at the open door and said nothing, because nothing needed saying, and she leaned back an inch and felt the solid fact of him there, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Now, if you've followed Grace and Levi all the way from that bench in Harlan's Creek to that cabin in the spring, I think you understand something they both had to learn the slow way, that the life we're given and the life we build are 2 different things, and sometimes the kindest act a person can perform is simply to sit down next to someone who has been left alone too long and refused to move. Grace sat down. She stayed, and in staying, she found everything she had stopped believing the road still held for her. If that story touched your heart the way it touches mine, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, was there a moment in this story where you knew Grace and Levi belonged together? Drop it below and let's talk about it. And if you'd like more journeys like this one, more stories from the old frontier where kindness proves stronger than cruelty, and love is built board by board and biscuit by biscuit, please subscribe and come back. We'll be here with another tale waiting. Good night. God bless you and yours, wherever this finds you.